when you look at kind of those high level three areas, attitudinal, actionable, and then financial metrics, really those areas are sort of the ones that you want to look at. And there's a series of measurements you can do within each one of those categories, and those need to align with whatever those tactics, strategies that you're trying to accomplish.
Wow. I really love how you broke it down into just three really clean categories. I wrote down attitudinal, actionable, and financial.
That's right.
And I hear you loud and clear when you say most marketers or C-suite, let's get to the financial.
Right.
But sometimes, if not always, maybe you need to take that step back. And how do you create that runway? You got to start where you start to get to that end result. And do you have any advice on how to build I call it a runway?
Yeah.
For measuring and tracking, like generally speaking.
Yeah, a runway is actually a really good metaphor when you think about that, because what you're doing is you're building a measurement strategy to support your organization. And so when you're starting to build that strategy, again, many people right away, they want to have those financial measurements. They want to say, I'm going to go into the market, I'm going to do this activity, maybe do patient acquisition around orthopedics, whatever it might be. And 3 months later, they're going to come back and say, well, this generated this many appointments, or this generated this much downstream revenue or contribution margin for that service line. And we all know in the reality of the situation, that doesn't happen. You need to build that up. So one of the first things when you're building your runway is you need to assess where you're at, what the materials of your runway will be. Because in many cases, organizations, they have multiple different ways that they're measuring different things. And so I talk a lot about developing a consistent data dictionary, starting to align things that are similar in nature. We talk about those three buckets. Well, in those three buckets, you can talk about different things in different ways. Reach on a pay-per-click ad may be a lot different than reach on a social media post, as opposed to reach in a newspaper article, for example. And so what you want to do is you want to start to standardize those different areas. I spend a lot of time with organizations talking about, in your data dictionary, understanding where those different components are. So, how do they align? How can we get consistent in our language before we even get started with measurement? Okay, because again, if you don't speak the same language, then it's going to get very confusing downstream. Then you want to sit down and you actually want to start to build your baseline measurements. What are you measuring right now? Right? How are you measuring? Where are the gaps in what you're measuring? And how can you potentially close those gaps? Because more times than not, when you're in a measurement approach towards a particular campaign or initiative or what have you, you're going to get 4 or 5 months down the road, and the gaps are going to become enormous if you don't capture those early on in the process. So try to take an assessment of where you're at and get those baseline measurements. And if you have areas where you can measure better, solve those, close those gaps. And if it's too difficult to do, and that may require involving other organizations, other departments, other areas of information. If it's too difficult to do, then very clearly up front state that there is a gap as we're going down this path, so that 3 months, 6 months down the road, you can come back to it and say, we've identified this, right? As a gap, we still need to close that gap, and it's becoming more and more important. So that's before you even get started, right? Before you even get going. Once you have all that in place, then you can start to map out your campaign, your initiative, whatever it might be, and ensure that you have all of your measurements in alignment. Then you can go into market.